All right. Well, welcome everyone to our staff discussion of All American Boys, which is the 2021 Washtenaw Read. I'm super excited to chat with you about it. And I have a bunch of different notes that I took that kind of things that I'm going to maybe guide us in different directions to talk, but feel free to bring up anything you noted or it's your discussion too. So I'm just here to help facilitate so that we touch on different topics. But I am going to get us started because I think what's really notable, there's a lot of notable things about this book, but it's super interesting that it's written by two authors, Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiely. And I'm just interested in how you thought that affected the book, why you thought they made the choice to write it together, and also if you think how you think it might have been different if only one person had written it or if it had been written from one perspective. I thought about that a lot while I was reading, and I'm just interested to hear what others thought.
I liked it a lot. I liked that there were two voices. And I thought that it brought more to the story, especially when Quinn begins to question his own thoughts and his own actions from the past, and to kind of begin to see how, having a perspective that you've been raised in, you don't really realize that that an action or a comment or something is really racist or even an idea until you're confronted with something that forces you to kind of look deeper. And I thought that it was important to see hear both of those voices, because it brings more to the story. I think it has additional meaning to the protest and how that protest is carried forward. I don't know, that was just my opinion. I thought that it was really good to hear both of those. And I guess to sort of hear someone who is awakening, a little bit in their perspective. So I thought that was a really good thing.
I think the two voices gave it some authenticity that was really what I came away with. Not that one of them couldn't have written both voices, but again, the authenticity of where they're coming from. I thought it was really good. I do hope a lot of people in the community read it across the county.
I agree with that point, Beth, about the authenticity. And I also think that the two different voices, for me, sort of underscored the idea in this book that like Quinn and Rashad are connected through people they know through their high school, but they don't know each other. So there's sort of like a connection, but a separation. And I just thought that the alternating voices really helped propel that part of the story.
One thing that I was thinking about is, both of the boys, they're good stories, and a book could have been written about either of them with this experience, and it probably would have been a powerful and meaningful book, even if we had just, read about Rashad's experience or read about Quinn's experience. But having both of them really gave us kind of two different viewpoints into an event that were very powerful, and honestly almost made the story more important to have both of those viewpoints. When I was reading, that's how I felt a bit.
Interesting. I can see why they did it with both viewpoints, but I found Quinn's story to be a little thin. Mm-hmm. And it may be because I mostly listened to it as an audiobook, and it was two different narrators. And I don't know if anybody else listened to it, but I don't know if I would have been less annoyed with Quinn had I read it. But I think the narrators did a really good job, but there was just something about him in the book that I didn't. His pieces read more to me like it was being written to be like, this is a problem. Let me explain to fellow white people why this is a problem. which is important, but it didn't feel quite so much as like natural as and I mean, Jason Reynolds also is just an incredible writer. So I think Rashad's parts to me felt more like compelling and less kind of like Quinn's parts felt like they had been written to get across a message, and that is valuable, but it didn't catch me as a story as much.
One of the things I think that they achieved by having two voices is to force some readers to not let themselves off the hook, right? Because like I think that for some readers, if you're reading a story about police brutality as it pertains to Black people, you can very much see it as a Black story. And I think that Quinn's presence is like, hey, if you're reading this and you think that this is a Black story, I'm gonna make you make an active decision to leave this book with that, as opposed to not. Because I do think that we saw him go through that, right? We saw him try to be like, this isn't my story, even though he was there in the event and was like close enough to like smell what was happening. He still wanted it to not be the story, which I think that many readers would want to. And I think that that's one thing that it brings to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to jump in and just say, I just find it's interesting to hear you say that you experienced Quinn's story in that particular way, Evelyn. I felt blown away by a moment where Quinn is wrestling with this feeling of, what am I going to do? What the hell am I supposed to do now? He's playing basketball and his coach asks him, where's your head at? And he goes, up my ass. I mean, there's this incredible like moment of a wave of change, like kind of rocking through him. And I felt, for me personally, that one of the lines that hit me hardest was on that same scene where Quinn says, here's what I realized, what I was saying beneath everything I was telling myself, like, I got to let this go. I got to forget what I witnessed. I didn't want my life to change from the way it was before I'd seen that. And that line had just reverberated for me. So I found, I didn't listen to the book, I read it, and I found that particular moment in Quinn's arc just explosive.
I think too that when the things that Quinn goes through in his head about the fact that the policeman involved is a family friend and someone who was like his father figure to him, makes those things that you're talking about, Lauren, it makes it even have more impact, because he knows both of the people involved. One, the policeman, he's closer with, actually, even though he probably sees Rashad every day. But, he's been close to the policeman in the past. So I think his decisions and the kind of agony that he went through and thinking about what can I do was pretty real to me when I was reading it.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that Quinn's character arc is pretty clear, right? Like, he is a white teen who eventually learns that being complacent in during situations like this is an act of racism, right? That's a pretty clear arc. But Rashad also, there's a character arc there. Rashad needs to learn things as well to be prepared to protest. So I think that was interesting, because one could assume coming into this book, Rashad, especially Rashad is somebody who experienced police brutality firsthand. It's going to be pretty clear cut for him, right? He's going to want to protest. He's going to, and I think what the book reveals is that it's not that clear cut for Rashad, which was a learning experience for me, that it's not so simple.
Mm-hmm. I just want to jump in regarding Rashad's family too. His father, his brother, the fact his father was a police officer and all that was revealed. I think it was a good way to show how everyone doesn't think the same way, and and just the different layers that can go into a person's thoughts about race in the first place, you know.
Plus, I think the amount of pressure that Rashad was under, because I mean, he's a teenager, he's 16 years old, you know, to see all of this stuff in the news about himself has to be just crazy to him. And then the pressure of his brother and his friends who want this protest. I could definitely see someone who's 16 and maybe a little like, ooh, how did I get myself into this, right? Doesn't want to really be the center of attention at that point.
Right. And then all of a sudden he's a symbol, you know, also.
Yeah.
And just in that way, it connects with Quinn, you know, Rashad all too, maybe doesn't want this thing to change his life in this way that it just irrevocably and inevitably will.
Yeah, well, and I guess the point of the book was that everyone who was involved had some part of their life changed. You know, the other students who, you know, I'm sure had opinions about police violence and brutality, but suddenly it's right there in front of them. And it's not just something they're reading about or participating in a protest for someone that they don't know. Suddenly it's personal, you know.
I think that different people were impacted a little bit differently by that, because I think that for people who watch people in their community be treated poorly by the police, I think it was always going to be personal to some people. And I think that for other people, maybe it wasn't. And I think that some people, like I imagine that some people in this story left having it never feel personal, right? Because like there was this very much us versus them. And there's this very much thing that's like, well, which side are you on? And for some of those people, I don't believe that they engaged with it. I think that they believed that Rashad must have done something. And I think that they believe that the cop was just doing his job. And I think that a significant part of those kids that were sitting in the cafeteria were pretty much unchanged.
And I think that Sherlania, I agree. And I think that at the end, they kind of even bring that up. And it was easy to kind of skim over, but Quinn, I believe, sees one of his white buddies just kind of head down going into basketball practice while the protest is starting. And I think that was kind of like, well, there's a lot of, you know, that was meant to indicate, you know, there's people who are ignoring this, who are going to go on with their lives. And they're choosing to be unaffected kind of. And I actually wished that there had been a little bit more about that in the book personally. And maybe a little bit more criticism of the people who sat in the cafeteria or not. I know it's hard to criticize, but I wish there'd been a little bit more. I mean, these are amazing writers, a little bit more like emphasis on all the people who were not choosing to be involved in any way. That I was like, I wish there had been a little more of that.
And I think that some of those people made a deliberate choice not to strike out, right? Because I think that this is, I think that this is a story of almost two communities being told through two people, right? Because we see a lot of enforcers in Quinn's life. His mother is an enforcer. The family that's a surrogate family for him are enforcers. The coach is an enforcer. Some of the instructors are enforcers. The school administration enforcers. All of these people are working together to try to all the people who are like, the neighborhood has gone downhill. Like, these are not passive background characters. These are people who are like doing their part to enforce the status quo, right? Like, I think the status quo, we don't see it as a character because that's what the status quo is, but there are active enforcers. And I think that the decision that Quinn had to make was less about like, do I protest, and more about, do I continue to be an enforcer, right? And I think that we see this theme because in the beginning, we see his mother say like, Quinn, you got to take responsibility. And then we see that very idea brought up again. And I think that was about him deciding, like, wait a minute, I am starting to recognize that I have been complicit in racism, and I am trying step by step, right? Like, because it wasn't like, oh my gosh, Quinn is like perfect now. I am trying step by step to like stop being an enforcer of the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, Sherlania, could you speak a little bit more about what you mean by Quinn being an enforcer? Because I think it's easy for maybe someone to read this book and read Quinn's perspective and go, he's being enforced. So how is he being an enforcer? Could you just speak more to that?
I think that he's making that decision, like whether to be an enforcer or not. For example, when he's dealing with the basketball players, right? And he's like, and he is saying to the other guy, despite the fact that we watched him go through all of this internal turmoil, he opens his mouth, and then like he is surprised that the words that he's saying are the words that he's heard, right? And so like that is him, being an enforcer, even though he's been trained to be, he's been acculturated to think that way. That's him playing that role, right? Or even when he's deciding like, do I even let people know that I was there? If I let people know that I'm there, then I disturb the narrative. If I do not let people know I was there, I enforce the status quo, right? Like we can think of something, and then and I think that I'm thinking about it this way because in the book, there is that lesson about active language and passive language. And I think that is there intentionally, right? And I think it's there for us to think about, when is Quinn passive? Like when do we see him as passive and when do we see him as an enforcer, right? Because like the same action can be two things, right? It's all depending on who is taking responsibility, this refrain that we heard from the mother and then taken on by Quinn later, I think.
And I think to complicate matters further is that the actual enforcing itself can be active and passive. Like I think about when they are at the family barbecue and nobody's talking about anything. That form of silence, especially amongst white families, is the ultimate enforcement tool. We are not going to talk about it. I don't care if Paul has his hand in a thing of ice. Paul's hiding in plain sight. But if you do not talk about it and you do not engage with it, and if you can trick your mind just to watch the football game and have a burger, that was something really interesting to see in the book as well, that I thought revealed one of the many facets of racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thank you for articulating that, because it was interesting. It was fascinating to have them have this barbecue, and they said, oh, they never have people over. That was mentioned a few times, and that they were coming together, and then to not discuss it. I mean, it was definitely a rally. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were rallying around him. So everyone there was really complicit, but then Quinn was starting to realize it, and especially having watched so closely. I mean, you can't see someone get the shit beat out of them and not be disturbed by it.
Right.
I don't know.
And how all the teachers were quiet too at school. I mean, silence was a big part of the book too, but I was thinking about that as well. Not only the barbecue, but also then they're back all in school together and the teachers just don't address it or intentionally try to avoid it.
Really complicit and saying, we're not talking about this.
Yeah, the coach. I found appalling, really. I was just like really appalled. And my dad having been a basketball coach, I was thinking, what would he do in a situation like this? And it wouldn't be that.
I think that caused a lot of problems for all of the kids, mm-hmm. whether they were, silent or not. There were problems there. And I also was like, at the end of the book, I was like, well, I kind of want to know now what happens after the protest. I want to know, what is this coach going to do? Is he actually going to tell all these kids that they're not going to, I don't know. I just thought it was really weird.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in again. I just wanted to say, like, by the same token, that narrative of, hey, let's all just leave all that stuff, check your emotions at the door. We're here to play and be a team. That is an attractive narrative. It's not as easy as being like, oh, that coach was a deadbeat. It's kind of like, well, I don't know. Maybe there is this feeling that we should all be colorblind when we're all on the team trying to do this other thing. Put your head down. Just again, that kind of, there's some comfort there, and it's a false comfort, right? Like there's this false comfort of everything's normal. And that showed up in that other scene where Quinn's walking into the cafeteria and wondering for the first time, where should I sit? You know, and his friend Guz, who is related to the police officer, his brother, you know, he gestures over like he's a mafia don. I think that was like the descriptor, right? And you realize like I felt viscerally like, okay, like Quinn has to decide what to do here, and it isn't clear. It's not like, oh well, sure, like I walk over and tell my friend like Guz, sorry Guz, I'm gonna sit outside in front of the graffiti. No, like it's not clear.
I think that when we think about the coach, we also have to think about the fact that the coach has his own motives, right? He is coaching this team. These scouts are coming for the first time. And like and this, like, in addition to the other dynamics that are going on with the other teachers, this is the coach's chance to have his glory. And I do think, sorry, Beth, because you just said that your dad was a coach, but I do think that a lot of coaches, particularly for sports like basketball and football and like these sports that we associate with like masculinity and like athleticism and stuff like that, half of these dudes are just trying to relive their glory days. Like they can't play football anymore, and so now they're trying to like relive through these boys. And if one of these boys gets picked up, that's for the coach. And that coach very well, I think, in part is like, so a kid got beat up. I don't want that to ruin the fact that like my team that I have built with all of my athletes has this chance, right? And he's framing it in terms of them and their opportunities, but he's got glory and opportunity writing on this as well. And we, you know, like we don't see inside of his head. We don't know how much he's motivated by that, but I think that deserves to be remarked upon.
I can't remember specific things that made me think, well, these kids aren't even really a team. I mean, they're not. I felt like the team building itself was lacking, just because they were so divided. But I mean, it's been a few weeks since I read it, so but that was what it was running through my head, was like, they don't seem very team oriented, because, you know, and they weren't really.
Yeah, well, I think that the, like, you know, leave it all at the door sort of thing is so counterproductive, because if you are bringing in like a real split team and then not like having them deal with what's actually going on, it's like sort of rotten from the core, right? So there's no way, I think, for them to like get to be an actual team while also maintaining this silence over, you know, this huge event.
And I think that was kind of,
sorry.
Oh, I think that was kind of used just to kind of be an example of, you know, the team couldn't play together because they weren't addressing the issue, right? Like there was they were fighting with each other. They weren't playing right. You know, they were trying to run plays and it wasn't really working usually. And I think that's in some ways kind of a metaphor for the larger community, right? Like if issues aren't being addressed, there's anger, there's there's disrespect, there's, you know, tons of things. And I thought that was kind of a microcosm that the authors used to represent, you know, you can't put it out of your head. You can't ignore this. That doesn't work.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say it feels emblematic of like trauma in general, you know, like how if you dislocate yourself from it, if you refuse to examine it, work through it, you know, to say nothing, or simply acknowledge it, you know, then there's just no way you will ever really grow. You'll never recover without examining it and head on. And I mean, it's complicated, of course, but I felt like what we saw and how, like Beth, you mentioned, you were saying, I don't really remember how like the teamwork thing went. Well, it ebbed and flowed, at least that's how I recall it. And it was like, there was a moment when Quinn was like, I'm so glad coach didn't have us come in and like put all our hands in and say team and stuff, because nobody was feeling that, you know. Yeah, trauma. Got to
Yeah.
acknowledge it.
Yeah,
I
totally.
think
Trauma and masculinity.
So Jacob, that's exactly what I want it to go, where I want it to go.
Yeah.
I think that we have to acknowledge also that like this whole idea of like, leave it all outside of here, put all your energy on the court is a very stereotypically male approach to things. And we see a lot of themes of masculinity in the book, right? Like this is a book about fathers and sons. This is a book about like sports. This is a book, like we saw like the like father male figures, right? Like even Quinn is expected to like take on this like male figure role for his brother, right? And then we see like the violent video games. We see like violence is a theme too, and we always see the violence acted out by men in this book, and we see the women being like the stabilizers and the emotional support, like both the, all over the place. We see Rashad's mother. We see the woman who was in the store stepping up to do the right thing. We see the woman who worked in the gift shop, and we see the girl whose name I can't remember right now.
Jill.
When we see Jill, right? Like we see this very different, and I think an exception is Rashad's older brother. Because I feel like he was like, he didn't really fall into like one or the other in the way that some of the other characters did, but I do think that this is a commentary on masculinity as well. And
it felt pretty darn real to me. I was reading this thinking like, this checks out to me, sadly, like that women are given this reign, this at least a certain amount of social acceptance to be empathic, to explore emotions and talk about them in a way that men are not given that kind of okay.
Well, but the other side of that coin is that these women are given the burden of the moral compass a lot of the time. Like it's the women are given this role to like try to pull people toward morality, whatever that looks like for the woman in question.
Yeah, like that was Jill's entire purpose in the book. She like didn't have nothing else.
Although there was also the white teacher who was kind of sitting quietly because they were told not to teach whatever lesson, and she's crying. And I was thinking a lot about the weaponization of white women's tears because she was crying about this lesson. And when I started reading it, I was like, oh, she's crying because she's sad about this Black kid getting beat up. And then it's kind of like, no, she's upset because she can't teach her lesson. Like it was a very weird.
Oh, I missed that.
I think
that is the one part that I did not.
It was a weird.
I actually wanted to bring up that scene.
I didn't pick up on that.
So just a quick recap. So it's an excerpt from Invisible Man that she's supposed to teach. And the principal actually had told her like, hey, I don't think like, let's move on to the next unit. Like the things are too tense to teach this right now. I personally did not understand why she was crying. I could not figure out what was going on there. And I found it fascinating when the kids start to read aloud the excerpt and they go around the classroom. And I like am still trying to kind of interpret that whole scene. And I think I missed, I remember it very clearly, but I think I missed some larger, I loved when the kids started reading. I thought I found that very moving and powerful. But I think I missed some larger message, and I wanted to get people's interpretations of that. Cause I was like, I didn't understand what the deal was.
So when
that scene
in the scene,
go ahead.
Oh, I have it right here. And she does say like, when she's like starting to cry, she says, I don't want to see this happen to any of my students. She said, catching her breath, I don't want to believe it still happens.
She's kind of in denial.
And then she apologizes and says like, I'm sorry. And I do think it is about like not being able to teach or not being told not to teach Invisible Man. But I don't think that's just like, she's sad because she doesn't get her lesson. I think it's like Invisible Man is such an important, like seminal text of Black America. And so being told not to teach that because it's like not white enough, basically, I feel like that's what, I don't know.
That scene, yeah, I felt all sorts of ways. I've spoken about this before, that I think when it comes to the American education system, when it comes to talking about race and teaching about race in America in the current American school system, there is only so much a teacher can do before an administrator walks in and goes, we got to prepare for the test.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, I can't think of a teacher that would cry like that in front of their students. Go walk out in the hallway.
Yeah, it's really appropriate.
It was, I didn't get it. And then I was forced to, it was like when you watch Freedom Writers, where you're like, this is a great story, but this isn't real life. This isn't how school works. Kids just start popcorning Invisible Man. No. It felt like it's supposed to be like a cinematic moment. That was like a feel-good cinematic moment where we see the students all come together. And I felt like that was not real to any experience. And it stuck out like a sore thumb, especially because when the majority of the rest of the book felt true to experiences that I have experienced. So this one thing I was like, go in the hall, take a breath, and then read the story.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think it's also can be like emblematic. It does seem forced, but I think that it's just a good example of like the times in this book where like it's the students and the kids who have to be the ones who are taking action, because the adults around them are not doing it. They would pull back into silence, or they would cry. So like maybe a class wouldn't read Invisible Man like that, but I think it's a good indication of them trying to put their voice forward. It's the same teacher where she says like, someone's missing from our class, and they're like, Rashad is absent from school today. So those are the kids that start to give voice to the movement. And maybe Jason Reynolds found like the words of Ralph Ellison to be powerful enough to propel that. But I do think it was a good way to just show that the kids were going to have to use their voices over the voices of adults.
So maybe the frustration I feel with that scene is the same frustration that inspired the kids to be like, well, our teacher's crying, let's read the story out loud. I had never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and there is also, I realized there's a part right after that part that I read where Quinn says that like he remembered this particular teacher saying she'd never follow what the department head or the administration wanted her to teach, but then all of a sudden now she has like this opportunity and she's like, oh, it's their fault that I can't read it. And there, I think like there are, like you were saying, Marissa, about like White Women's Tears being like an out, for actually like addressing hard things.
I feel like the author's hand was like really strong in this scene, right? And I feel like the scene was in there for 1,000 reasons. And I think that one is to call attention to the issue of the weaponization of white women's tears, right? Because like these kids are impacted, right? And then we've got to stop. Like what white women's tears do is like it makes you stop and deal with them, right? Like it makes everything stop and deal with them, right? And I think that was one of the ideas that the author is trying to put down. I also think that the authors took this opportunity to communicate against a popular misconception about like whether somebody is being racist or not. And it's the use of the N-word, right? And so like, that is the only time the N-word comes up in this book. It is through this text. And that is one way to say like, hey, for all of you guys who are reading this, thinking that like, if you don't use the N-word, that means that you are not racist. Let us disabuse you of this notion, right? Like, I think this book is trying to do a lot. And I think that like you guys are saying, this scene is saying like kids know what's up. You know what I'm saying? Adults always pop in to talk about what kids can't handle when adults don't want to engage with something that's difficult, right? And here I think that when they, chorus lines step up and start singing the same song, because it's what like scene in the movie this was, right? I think that it was the author, reminding us kids know what's up. You know, like you don't have to, like kids are having their pockets turned out in stores every day. Like don't tell them that they don't have what it takes to like study Invisible Man, because they already know what's up. And I think that that's part of what this scene achieves.
Can I bring up a totally different thing that I was curious about?
Sure.
I wondered what people made of the emphasis on Rashad being totally innocent of anything. And there is like one point where and I can't remember which if it's in a Quinn or a Rashad chapter, and I can't remember who says it, where it's like, well, even if he was stealing, he didn't deserve this.
Yeah, I think
like
Quinn.
Even somebody who would steal wouldn't deserve that. But I felt like there was such an emphasis on like him being innocent, where it was, and not so much like that, oh, that wouldn't happen, but more like, well, what does it matter if he was stealing or not? Either way, this shouldn't happen.
I think in some ways the authors wanted to make this book I think making it clear cut I'm not saying they were looking for like an easy job, but I think adding more kind of gray area would have made things more complicated. And I think that there's already a lot of subtle messaging in the book in many ways. And I guess my interpretation of that, because I wondered that too. I was like, in some ways it almost would have been, I don't want to say more interesting, but if he had like pocketed a bag of chips, like that still doesn't mean that anyone deserves to be a victim of police brutality. But I think that like, I don't know. For me, I was like, I wonder about that, because there was such emphasis, Evelyn, I agree. But I think it was just because like there are plenty of innocent Black men who get targeted by police all the time. And like, this is like, let's make this one of them, because that happens. And we don't need to introduce the gray area of like some innocent, some not, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, it makes me wonder if, like, I think had there been more complexity, had Rashad like stolen some chips or something, like we would have been looking at a novel that was like 300 more pages long or something, you know, like maybe it's just like we can't, for the sake of the story, we need to kind of keep this a little more. Yeah, like you mentioned, Elizabeth, like there's plenty of complexity in this story already. And maybe, the typical reader of this book may not be, I'm thinking the typical maybe white reader of this book maybe would feel like, oh, okay, well, there was the thing about the fact that he stole the chip. So I don't, I just wonder if maybe that's an indictment of where society is in general, American society is in dealing with these issues. The fact that Rashad needed to be kind of like an innocent.
But I think that complexity is there, at least in this way. Gosh, I'm always holding something when I'm talking, and I should put it down. While Rashad is in the store being abused by the police, Quinn's behind the store drinking liquor with his friends. And they make mention that, we've stolen a couple beers from there once or twice. So like that, those two images are put up against each other. And Quinn is so unaffected by any sort of repercussions for his behavior. The same place where he stole beer from is the place where he's now posted outside trying to get somebody to sell him beer while he drinks liquor, being 16 years old.
Yes,
you know what I'm saying?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
Yeah. So like the chips were stolen, but they were stolen by Quinn.
Mm.
And it wasn't chips, but it was beer.
I wish they would have gone back to that in sort of the same way that I felt like they kept going back to Rashad being innocent. I just feel like there was a real emphasis on it. And I can see why it was part of the story, but I don't know.
I think that like when we ask that question, we're taking for granted that people will feel that he didn't deserve it in any way. Because I do not believe that every reader would feel that way.
Yeah.
I think that I think that, hundreds of thousands of people read this book. And I think that a good like slice of the pie chart would feel that feel that he asked for it if he stole the chips. And I think that the authors, particularly the Black author, is hyper aware of that. You know, it's like they're even Rashad's father in this book is like, well, did he ask for it?
Yeah. How was he dressed?
You know,
I mean, keep in mind, he hasn't stolen, he couldn't have stolen anything yet because he hasn't even gone to the counter to pay. I mean, how can we be talking about, you know, maybe he would steal the chips, maybe he wouldn't, but he hasn't walked outside the store. He's still inside the store. He's still, you know, shopping, I guess, at that point.
And even the thing about the chips was an occurrence looking for a narrative, right? Because the original narrative wasn't about the chips. The original narrative was about saving this innocent white woman.
Right.
And when she went away, like they needed a new narrative for why he was the trouble, right? Like the original narrative, the original problem, the original reason that he was even, you know, being looked at had nothing to do with the chips.
Right. Yeah, this discussion is making me like little light bulbs going off again in a bigger way, you know, and I read this, I kind of went, oh, that's that. And then just hearing this is making me think about how we are, again, as a culture, guilty of a double standard here between white boys and Black boys, you know, doing stuff. You know, I appreciate you bringing that up, Jacob, that the fact that there's a white boy who's trying to like legit do something sketchy here. And he is not a threat, perceived as a threat, in a way that a Black boy who, I believe it was Quinn said later, oh, that guy, Rashad, like, he's like a guy who's always trying to keep his head down and stay out of trouble, right? That guy, like, you know, there's this, it's just so painfully clear, the double standard at work here. And that growing up too fast. I mean, it's not just Black boys, Black girls too, for sure. But it's just that is what's going on here.
You know,
go ahead. No,
I don't want to talk in generality, but I think it's probably safe to say that in our country, in America, most children growing up of color, if they are in a school that's integrated at all, they face some form of racial discrimination on an almost daily basis. And it's interesting to hear, this is, I guess, why I said it's interesting to hear the two voices in the book, because it's interesting to kind of see from the outside someone who's struggling a little bit with this. And I think that it's all colored by the fact that, you know, our parents, when we're kids, have so much influence on us. And so you may never think about it as a kid, about what kind of messages you're hearing in the world, but they're ingrained in you until you finally start to realize as you grow older that, oh, not everybody thinks this way. Not everybody feels this way. I don't know. I think that the having the two voices thing was really important for this book.
I think that Black children in school, even in non-segregated schools, face racial discrimination every day.
Right, because they're not in school all the time. Yeah.
No, I think that they face racial discrimination in their Black schools.
Oh,
100%. Like, I don't think that racial discrimination is limited to environments that are highly integrated. And I think it manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. For example, I think that one extension of racism is colorism, right? So you can have like, which is a thing that can like be applied even if you have a Black school with all Black teachers, but most Black schools don't have all Black teachers, and people are making value judgments about children that they are in some, even when all of the kids are Black. Like one of the ways that I think that Black children in schools face racial discrimination has to do with like expectations on achievement broadly. But I do think that, like, you know, maybe the light-skinned kid, or maybe the mixed kid, maybe the teacher makes an assumption that they are less likely to be trouble than the other one. Or maybe the administration at the school is making an assumption that they're all trouble, right? And so I think that I just felt compelled to mention that I think that the racial discrimination that Black and brown children face in schools is not limited to situations where they're among white students, because racism is pervasive.
Yeah,
I think very often, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think very often Black children are not seen as children in the educational system, particularly Black men. That's why, or Black children, they're children. Even when you're 16, you're a child. That's why we see images of cops in schools yanking that Black girl out of the desk, tasing her in the lunchroom. These things happen because they are not perceived as children. They are perceived as adults or a threat.
Yeah.
So to take it even further, I think that one place to start is to see Black youngsters as children.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you end up with 12-year-old Tamir Rice shot because he was playing around with a water gun. You know what I'm saying?
For sure.
And Dee, I wasn't disagreeing. I wasn't saying, I just want to be clear. Like, I wasn't like, I disagree with you. I was like, yes, and like, and I want to make sure that I
absolutely
that it didn't feel like a hey, because I didn't mean it that way.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. You're right. The discrimination is so prevalent everywhere. It's hard to not have that be an impact.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, I think of that, like Black kids not being seen as kids, is that like white people are given the benefit of innocence for their entire lives. And I think that there's like a lot of narratives, particularly of like white women's innocence, going back for forever. But I also think like that, this is a scene where like Quinn is given like all the benefit of innocence in the world when he is actually doing something he shouldn't do. And the Black kids in the story are never given that benefit of innocence.
Yeah, that comes up again when even I think when Quinn is talking to someone, one of his friends, and he's like, I don't know, what do we really know about Rashad? Like maybe he was doing drugs, and the friend's like, actually, Quinn, that's you. Like you are the one who is doing drugs. We don't know anything about Rashad except that we've seen him in his uniform. So it's just that flipping of that.
That was actually
where we see innocence is interesting.
So, sorry, I just wanted to say, Lucy, that was almost a humorous moment to me as I read it. When Quinn is getting kind of checked by his friends, like, wait a second, like, dude, you're the one who's like smoking weed, like, yeah. And I just wanted to say too that moment, like the out that Quinn is given, the innocence of that a white boy is sort of handed, as like, like you can just go ahead and walk away. You can walk up to your friend and act like it's all cool. You can, this guy helped raise you. You can play that card, just like all of these ways in which the society is conspiring to allow this white boy to not own up to the reality he witnessed. All the ways in which society conspires to hand white people in general in America this like pass of innocence. I mean, I just need to give a quick shout out to, James, the documentary about James Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro, which to me, one of the heaviest hitting scenes was this rolling a clip of, just white people kind of dancing around, acting silly over the years in the 20th century, and Baldwin is talking about how this innocence is actually harmful.
I also thought that the revelation about Rashad's father, when he was a police officer, having shot a kid, was another part of the story that had importance and played a big part. It shocked Rashad, and upset him. I think probably upset his father even more, I guess, from his reaction. But how did you guys feel about that part when you read it in the story? Because he was a policeman too. So I don't know. I know that there's a difference there between thinking someone's going for a gun and shooting them and finding out afterward that they weren't. But I mean, that's something that we hear all the time now in the news. Oh, I thought this person was going for a gun. Mm-hmm. And it's such a problem, I think, with the police force. I don't know. What were you guys thinking?
I think what I appreciated about that being a part of the story is that there was no... Rashad and his father did not come together and have a hug and say, everything's all right now. Rashad's father left that room after that conversation and was, if I remember it right, it was, Rashad described it as like, his father was completely dimmed. And at the end, Rashad's father does come to the protest, but that's kind of the only closure that we get. I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation between these two characters, and knowing that that's the riff between the father and Spoonie as well. But like, I just danced around your question. I didn't really answer it. So I'm just going to be quiet.
I mean, how did you think it impacted the story overall? You know?
Well, I thought it was great to illustrate that these things happen. And I, not to put it so callously, but and just that his father had that experience. And it also demonstrates how the father had his own biases too, because he was about how kids are dressing. But okay, how did it affect the story? I think it just was an eye opener about the family history and that what the father had experienced to me. But there was still a lot of mistrust amongst them.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he leave the police force after that?
Yeah, he did.
So it basically spurred his quote unquote retirement. And I guess we don't know if he was forced to leave or if he chose to leave. I got the impression that he chose to. And I thought that was an interesting illustration of the difference. And obviously this is something that haunts him, and something he regrets that he believes is a huge mistake. And I just think that stood out in contrast to Paul's response, mm-hmm. which is denial. Mm-hmm. Come on, man, I was just doing my job. That kind of thing. So that was one takeaway I had, is just, he recognizes he made a mistake. He basically retires from the police force and he's kind of haunted from this mistake that he made, in contrast to what Paul's reactions were from beating Rashad. But I guess that was my only takeaway. But I found that an interesting revelation, and I wasn't completely sure why the authors felt that should be in the story. So I'm glad you brought that up, Dee. That was something I had taken note of to ask folks about their interpretations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it does demonstrate a huge difference between the two police officers. And it certainly, I think it has an impact on the relationship between Rashad and his father. I think it gives Rashad an opportunity to maybe have more understanding about his father and perhaps some of the ways that his father is very strict with him out of maybe fear. Like, if I could be someone who shoots an innocent child, then anybody can. So these kids of mine have to be super careful, super diligent, super, disciplined, etc. And I think that even without having had that experience, that a lot of parents would feel the same way. You know, I want my kids to be absolutely straight in line, you know, never talk back, because you're at such a high risk.
I think that we also have to think about the fact that the police is another organization where like this group identity is very important, right? And so like his father, much like this book in some ways reminded me of The Hate You Give. But in both of these cases, you watch like police officers have this very strong alliance with their fellow police officers until they are in a situation where they have to like put up two affinity groups against each other, right? And I think that that's something that we have to think about. But you know, for his father, like one of these groups is a group that he chose to belong to, and another is a group that he like can't escape, right? And I think that that's a dynamic. I also think that one of the arguments in this book is like you can try to protect it, like as a parent of a Black child, you can try all you want to protect them, but you can't. You simply cannot in a racist system, right? Because like this other kid was like innocent, and this other kid literally was like fighting for his life so that he could breathe, and then that's part of how he died, you know. And I think that that's another thing, right? Like we now see, I mean, I think that a Black reader, I think that many Black readers are always going to see like his father, like trying to tell him exactly what to do with his father protecting him. But like we see another layer to that, right? Because we see that his father was this person. But I think that another thing that's important in the conversation about that is that even his father was like, not all police officers are wolves, in that he acknowledges that some police officers are wolves, right? Like he directly, or I guess not directly, but he like pretty strongly acknowledges that there are wolves among the police officers when he says that. And so I think that it's important also to point that out, right? And that he was like, I decided to be a police officer because I wanted to make a difference, right? Like if he's wanting to make a difference, he is wanting to be, you know, I don't know what you want to call, like a dog, like a friendly dog among the wolves.
A sheepdog.
Right? Yeah, a sheepdog among the wolves. And I think that those are also important strains to think about in that dynamic.
Yeah, I don't think this gets talked about nearly enough, you know, and just in general in America, this idea that it's complicated, like policing is complicated. And I felt like just personally speaking, you know, the events of the last year, kind of all of a sudden, I felt like this notion of defunding the police was like just exploded across the national consciousness. And it felt like, to me, whoa, we're going there. We're going into this territory. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but we're having to reckon with this complexity, Sherlanya, that you speak to, of like, or that you're pointing to when you're talking about wolves versus, you know, sheepdogs amongst this, you know, narrative that I think that pushes against the narrative that used to sort of be more widely accepted, right? Which is like, in the police are here to protect us, period. You know, they're the people who are out getting stuff done. You know, watch any given episode of Cops, they're taking down the baddies, you know, whatever it is that's kind of getting to our consciousnesses. That was the message. And now this is what you're pointing to is just, I just want to go, yeah, that, you know, let's talk about that. That's all.
I read the book, I think, before the 6th. But anyway, just what we've been hearing about the insurrection and the number of police officers and military folks involved, it's not surprising, but it is shocking to see the numbers and to see, and it's like, oh, now it's understandable. I mean, it was all, you know, why do Black men keep getting killed by police officers? Well, because they're racist inherently. I mean, a lot of them are, and not everyone, but clearly it's an issue. And the idea that all those people storming the Capitol weren't a threat, and what they did. I mean, it's a tangent too, but it was just right there in front of everyone. So obvious that this is what happens.
Well, it's like, Beth, how you were talking about like it being such a, that you like hear in the news so much, like police officers saying like, well, I shot him because I thought he was reaching for a gun. And then you think about like the protests at like the state capitol, where it's just like literally a crowd of white people with military grade like guns strapped to them.
Yeah.
There is so much to discuss with this book. I think we could go on for several more hours.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to be respectful of the time on the event and of your time, but I want to conclude with asking, so this book ends with the protest, right? And I think Dee had brought this up earlier, actually. We don't know what happens. We don't know, it seems like they're going to go to court. We have no idea. I think that was a deliberate choice by the authors that we don't know. But I'm wondering how you all felt about the ending, and about just generally how you felt about this book as a choice for the Washtenaw Read this year. And I also just want to mention now that I welcome anyone to join the public discussion, which is taking place on February 10th. It's a Wednesday evening at 7. So please bring all these wonderful thoughts and more to that. But I do want to ask what you thought of the ending and just what you thought of this as the Washtenaw Read for this year. I'm super interested to hear your thoughts.
In terms of the read, I think it's a brilliant pick. I mean, among other things, sorry, Dee.
Thank you.
Among other things, I am really glad to see a teen book be picked, because I think sometimes the read tends to be a little bit more on the academic side. And so I like that this is feels like it's really for everybody.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with that totally.
I thought it was a great choice to have a teen book, and really throughout the time I was reading it, I just, the back of my head, I was like, gosh, I really hope that some people are enlightened by these perspectives, or understanding a little more about Black kids or kids, or, just the perspectives. I'm hoping it does enlighten some people.
Yeah, I just want to say I knew nothing about Jason Reynolds, or I can't even pronounce the other author's name, Brendan Kiely. Kiely?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, but it's just that, it was a really great story. It was a hard-hitting story. Obviously, it's incredibly topical. But I think just more than that, if someone is looking for a story, like a new perspective on a huge problem, very complicated. If you're interested in just a very well told story, I personally was incredibly emotionally impacted by this story, and I would totally recommend it.
Me too.
I was honestly kind of unsettled by the ending. Only because I felt the immense dread of, if a trial were to happen, all the shenanigans that can happen within that trial.
Oh.
And it became very real to me how Black people who are a victim of police violence, if they want to pursue it in a court, it is just reliving trauma. Mm-hmm. And I finished the book and I was like, I feel full of dread. And I know these aren't real characters, but they are real characters. And what happened to Trayvon Martin could happen to Rashad, and that made me feel full of dread.
I think that's an interesting way to sort of think about the book, the ending of the book carrying off the page into real life. Like what you're saying, Jacob, is that you felt dread because you have seen this very thing play out and the possibilities. But keeping it open like that in the ending, I think is a good reminder of this book. The story doesn't stop here. Just, you can put the book down, but just then maybe look around,
Yeah.
It's going to keep going.
I read the ending sort of as a recognition that justice doesn't always come from the court and the police system that is producing these situations exactly. So it felt more realistic and ended that there is some hope for change, but it might come from different avenues.
Well, thank you all again. I am so grateful for all your perspectives. I love these conversations because I feel like they add so much depth to my understanding of the books that we read, because we all just have our own perspectives and we can try to think about things, but hearing the way other people interpret things is just awesome. Like, it makes me so, I mean, even though this is many ways a deeply sad story, I'm like happy right now because I get to think about it more in new ways. So I appreciate it. This is going to air next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday on February 3rd. So if you want to watch us all again, you can, but the public will be able to tune in. And again, on February 10th at 7 p.m. is the public discussion, and that you are all more than welcome. I would encourage you, if you're available, to join in. That will probably run slightly differently, but just with some passages to pull out and some more maybe direct questions. But we'll see how that goes too. And you're all welcome to join in for that. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all.